Recording in progress.
Hello, everybody out there. Welcome back to The Broken Brain. It's me, as always, Dwight, here with you today. We are talking about the intersection between psychology, culture, and in this case, trauma. Anybody knows I'm a big fan of trauma. Not so much, more what to do about it. Not an advocate for getting traumatized, but I find I don't have to advocate that. That seems to take care of itself in our world. And so we'd like to talk about what we can do about that, and that is what we're talking about today. My guest today is Dr. Mary Catherine M.C. McDonald, and she is a research professor, an author, and an expert in trauma and what to do about it. She's the author of the recent book, The Joy Reset: 6 Ways Trauma Steals Happiness and How to Win It Back. Dr. MC, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you about trauma and joy.
Yes, and it's such a great connection. I love how you have this connection idea of trauma and joy, and we're going to obviously get into that. What can you tell people about yourself and how you got into working with all this fun stuff?
Yeah, I always tell people, I wish it was one of these stories where I could be like, well, I knew at 14 that I was going to whatever, but it was not at all that. It was a very bumpy road. I came to this
that's
field.
More interesting anyway.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And we should admit these things, there's a lot of mistakes on the road and I still ended up somewhere that I like. So that's important, I think. But I started in actually psychoanalysis, and I was looking at grief. And I thought this was interesting because just what I was reading in class. I had had some early grief experiences, but nothing really life-shattering. But while I was writing my master's thesis on grief, both of my parents died really suddenly, and I was 24. And so it was sort of this mix of the intellectual experience and then the lived experience really kind of coming together. And then I went on to my PhD program and wanted to study identity, because there was this debate going on at the time about the extent to which identity is shaped by story. And there was, there's a whole 150 years of people arguing that we are essentially a story. Our life is a story, right? Beginning, middle, and end. All of the things we do sort of cohere in a story form, or they don't. And that's what can cause kind of issues psychologically. But then there was this other side that was arguing that that's not true, that we aren't narrative, and that we shouldn't try to be, because this causes problems. And I just found that stance completely nonsensical. How do you live without any sense of the past or future, or where, all this stuff. And so I reached for trauma as sort of a use case in a larger argument about identity, because in every case of someone who's experienced trauma, you can almost just wait for the moment in their story where they say, the story shattered and I had to start over, or the chapter ended and I had to start a new one, or the book closed, all of these metaphors.
We talk about a new chapter of life, or...
Yeah.
And I find that, the details of someone's story are always important. And I say that, and people who listen to this know probably both if you listen enough. And if you don't know this, you aren't listening enough, everybody. Gentle rebuke. No, but... The story of a trauma has been downplayed. I think everyone knows I'm a fan of modern trauma techniques that are designed to, but I think that we oversell the idea that they're made to get rid of it fast. I think that they are good at reducing anxiety, and the acuteness perhaps of that is faster with some techniques like EMDR and IFS and those things. But on the other hand, I don't know. My experience has always been that I have clients who have told me, even some who've been through those techniques, and they're not and ones I've done it with, who are I still want to talk about it. I want to process it. And they've come and sought me out because I'm willing to talk about it, because they're yeah, I do feel better, but my therapist told me it's not important. I don't want to talk about it anymore. That the details just bog us down. And I think there's I think it's anti-trauma narrative, because that would keep people out of therapy. And I get that. But the idea of okay, I've controlled the acute panic, but now I want to talk about it. So I'm a big believer in that story mentality, that people still want to talk about it even after benefiting from the techniques that don't require it, if that makes sense.
And that's 100%. I'm so in alignment with that. I was actually just talking about that with somebody the other day. Yeah, we have to get away. We have the wrong frame on healing, and we have to get away from this idea that there is a quick fix, right? Because healing process is about integration. And the trauma experience needs to be integrated into the rest of your memory files, just like everything else you experience, positive things, neutral things, and bad things that aren't like, that don't raise to the level of trauma. And I think it's a tricky thing right now, because I think some people are trying to avoid this very real problem of over identification with trauma, where you sort of reduce your entire self to your trauma story. And I get that, but I just don't believe you can get around telling the story and integrating it in a narrative way, just because that's how human psychology works.
Mm-hmm.
When we have an incoherent story, or a story we can't process, it poses a problem for the brain. And so you have to figure out how to get to that. And again, to what you just said, like, if 12 sessions of EMDR reduces your acute symptoms, that's amazing. You should do that. There's nothing against EMDR at all. But a lot of these therapies that are kind of being billed as one-stop shopping are really adjunctive
Or even
therapies
one
that need to.
session shopping. That one
Yeah,
makes
I
me
know.
nervous,
That's
to be honest with you.
horrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's some out there that are, like legit torture, right? Prolonged exposure therapy. I've gotten in some trouble writing about, because it's
Ooh, I like this.
depending on how it's used, can be profoundly triggering towards this end of like, let's get it out as soon as we can, right? It's not a tumor.
You're right, exactly. I to quote Arnold Schwarzenegger in Kindergarten Cop, but
As we should always.
we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that movie today, but
Yeah.
or maybe just that amount of time. But I also found that one of the things that the trauma narrative, I feel like the worst part of it is that it keeps people believe that that's what they're going to be forced to do, and they don't want to do it, so they don't go to therapy.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and yes, the prolonged could be too much and all that too. But yeah, the idea, I've met several people, not so much now, because I think we're better at advertising maybe what we actually do, but the idea that, oh, I'm going to have to talk about this again and again and again, and I'm going to leave therapy. So, and I know what happens when I think about it, so I don't want to do that. So then they don't go to therapy. They don't put their kids in therapy, and so then they don't benefit.
Ouch. Yeah. I think, like, if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to get everybody to understand that we can do this by, Peter Levine's thing about pendulation, right? Like, you can kind of come into the trauma story and then you come back out. And that's one of the things we're doing in therapy, is figuring out how to like approach the thing that's too big and scary to take on your own, but then also to kind of bring you back to a level of like nervous system regulation, where you don't leave the session feeling awful and triggered and crying in the car. And
that's that good application of some of those modern techniques that if I can learn, because if we're doing them right, usually at the end of a session, we'll kind of check in and calm and, use those skills. So, yeah, absolutely. Well, when we look at that, I think you hit on this already, that there's a lot of sensitivity to the pop psychologization, term I just made up, of a lot of terms. And you hear people push back on the TikTok maybe thing of like, oh, we're going to use the word trauma, we're going to use the word triggered, we're going to use the word gaslighting, and people turn against it and say it's being used too much. And someone, the barista writing, I don't know, getting my order wrong wasn't gaslighting if they told me I ordered that. I get it. But also then we throw out really useful concepts, right? And say, so maybe what would you define as trauma, and how do we look at that as a scale of what is, our experience with trauma?
Can I say something really quick about the TikTokification of psychology? That I have wrestled with this so much. And I, for like a year and a half, was just like, we need more nuance here. Like, that's like what I kept saying, but that's not an interesting sentence to anybody, but it's true, right? We need like,
it's like, no, I want you to be more extreme.
Right, exactly. Be more singular. And because that's what drives social media clicks and all this other stuff. But I think the thing that I've settled on, this is very recently, is like these terms that are being floated out there are good if and only if we use them as an opening, not an ending.
Oh, and so I think
what's happening so often is that someone will be like, I'm being gaslit. Boom, end of chapter. And it's like, well, just hold on. Where are you playing a role in that dynamic? What is the person trying to accomplish by gaslighting you? How do you become more aware of that and engage with it differently? Maybe this is somebody that you shouldn't engage with at all, instead of you're a narcissist, boom, and it's, or I have ADHD, boom, end of story, right? No, that's the door.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that word and these diagnoses can be so helpful and validating, but only if we use them as an entry point to something else. That's my soapbox on
That's
that.
an excellent, and that's also I think a lot and have shared on here about ways to look for good sources when we go out to social media, because that's the flip side. Is there's so much information that it may be even worth the cost of people, not always doing it. But if you're smart about how you Google, if you're smart about what you look for, and nuance is a great tool to look for. But also what you just said, I love that. That's actually a new tool in my toolbox is, does this lead somewhere, or does it stop there, or where does it lead? Right. Yeah. That's
right.
Really cool.
Yeah. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Everyone in my life is a narcissist. Okay. That's a pattern we should notice.
Especially what are we going to do about things I don't care for.
Right. Exactly. Indeed. Okay. But you asked me about the definition of trauma. So one of the kind of reasons that I fell down this rabbit hole of trauma and then just moved in was because when I went to reach for trauma as sort of a use case in a larger argument about identity, I realized that psychologists were still arguing about the definition of trauma. And in some sense, that's the nature of psychology. It's a science. We're trying to, improve all of these designations and how we treat them based on updated science and new things and whatever. But it seems like a fight that's been happening for like 150 years. What are the kinds of things that count as traumas and what do not? And so I spent a good deal of my graduate life trying to figure that out. And I ended up grabbing some information from neuroscience and from psychology and then from philosophy, which kind of takes a critical stance on the whole thing. Not to say this is negative, but to let's look at this critically and see what's going well and what isn't. And the definition that I use is anytime you have an unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home, you have the potential for lasting trauma.
Once again, I like this. How would you break down that for people? What is a relational home?
Yes. So important. The first part. So I think we have to bear and integrate everything that happens to us, positive, neutral, and negative. And for the most part, we can do that, right? You go to the grocery store, something funny happens. You, within a couple of hours, file that away into the long-term filing system of your brain in the folder that says funny anecdotes I can tell at cocktail parties, right? And we do that so seamlessly, we kind of, I think, miss that we're doing it until we have something that we can't bear. And then that thing sticks out because our brain doesn't know where to put it or how to put it down. And that's sort of the origin of trauma symptoms. It's essentially like a disease of memory. And what we need in the case of something that is unbearable is a relational home, meaning a place where someone can relate to us in the overwhelm, help us hold some of it, and potentially help us integrate it.
So and then that can part be of the story instead of its own overwhelming event that changes the whole story.
Yeah. And that's sort of sticking out and causing all these problems. And because I think one of the other things we need to do is think about trauma symptoms as adaptive, right? They're attempts at the brain and body level to get you to integrate the story that you couldn't integrate before. And I think that shift helps us see that the trauma response is actually biologically a strength response and not a sign of weakness or disorder. In fact, it's scientifically incorrect to call it a disorder. And that's not to say, of course, the symptoms cause in immense pain and suffering. But I think if we start with that reframe, then we can peel away some of the shame, which helps us to heal.
And so kind of proactively, this sounds like a good early on kind of thing, is trying to recategorize or reframe, relabel. Those are all terms. Into saying this is something that happened. And it's not I like that. So it's not like, oh, this happened, so I'm broken, or this happened and
Yeah.
And I hear people say this a lot. It's where sometimes even in advocacy, when they talk about abuse prevention and
Mhm.
different things, where they'll say this happened and it ruined someone, and you're going to ruin someone's
I know.
life. Their
I
life was
know.
ruined by this, ruined. And I'm like, there's someone who was victimized out there who's reading that and saying like, yeah,
I know.
right.
I'm ruined. Yeah.
And many times people, especially when they're at a young age, will report that the reactions that their caregivers had to their abuse was just as or more traumatic than the abuse itself.
Yeah.
In their own
100%.
perception, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Because what they need is that relational home, and they're not meeting, they're meeting the opposite of that, right?
Yeah.
Someone who judges them or shames them or tells them not in it with an intent to judge them. Okay, well, now you're broken. Damaged goods, I think, is one of the most harmful phrases in the human language, in the English language, because
Yeah.
it's what an objectification. Like,
And
and that,
sometimes we have this kind of trauma porn mentality, sort of
yeah,
like there's
100%.
this
Yeah.
story, and especially if it's our own kid and we're telling the story again and again or whatever, that it's like, and we can, and sometimes I think that's where the pressure comes into embrace, because I feel like you can embrace in a healthy or less healthy way to say this is part of my
Yeah.
story and it's my whole thing, and it's like
Right.
sometimes that can really, and I've met a lot of people who almost get to a part of saying, oh, look at me, I'm so fucked up and my life is that way, and that's almost, and let me paraphrase this. It's probably better than being like I'm damaged goods, but to lean into
Yeah.
that of like, it almost becomes a version of that though, where that's the only way I can empower myself. And
Yeah.
it's better than being disempowered, in my opinion. On the other
Yeah.
hand, it's like there's a more empowering
100%.
way of saying like, I've had maybe, this happened to me, but I am a survivor. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So the book that I wrote before the Joy Reset was called Unbroken, and it's about this trauma response and trying to reframe this idea that like if you go through these things or if these things happen to you, you're broken, because that's not true. We can't be broken, right? We can be maybe bent or dented, but I don't think we can be broken. Um, and I got into a really interesting conversation with the sensitivity reader who was going through the final edit of the book, who wanted me to only use survivor. They thought that victim was a charged word that reduced the identity of the person to victimhood. But I said, I'm not actually comfortable with that. I go back and forth because I think that there's sort of like a timeline to it. There is a moment in which you are a victim, right? This thing happened to you that you had no control over. And I think part of the integration of that experience is understanding what that means, right? Like not just in terms of that event, but existentially, like that we are vulnerable in that way as human beings, that things can happen to us that we don't have control over. That's part of any trauma integration, is kind of figuring out how are you going to dance with that idea. But then I think the thing is, to your point, like if you are out of the acute, trauma phases, if you're into many years down the road and you're still saying this is the only or most important thing about me, then you're into that space where you're maybe over identifying with the trauma and making it your whole identity. And that is really tricky, because if the trauma is your identity, then by definition, you can't heal, because healing would mean giving up your identity. And so you get really stuck there.
I know that I have been guilty of this as well, of offering in the spirit of comfort that, oh, you're so strong. Now, I didn't say it
Yeah,
that way because I didn't understand that it should be said that way before. No,
sure.
but the problem is that sometimes we overemphasize the survivor, and this is interesting with terminology
Yeah.
as you're putting it. I hadn't thought about that. The strength and it's not inappropriate to know that I'm strong, that I'm a survivor
Right.
and everything. On the other hand, I think the risk that I see there and I've run into is I may inadvertently send the message that you're only valuable because you're strong, and you're not. And
Mhm.
none of us are always strong,
Right. Well,
Uh,
and also that the pain isn't relevant, like, because I think there's a way in which that message can be really dismissing, because you're saying
yeah,
I'm in
right.
pain, and then someone else is coming in and saying you're strong, and you're like, well, but I'm trying to tell you I'm in pain, and you're telling me I'm strong. Like, what are we how is this helpful,
Exactly. And am I only value when I'm carrying it well? And how much does that come
Yeah.
across as, hey, carry your burden well and don't bother me about it. Right.
Right.
Is
And
that
be
the message that
quiet.
people
Yeah.
hear? Right.
Right. Be a good survivor.
Yeah.
Right. Do it the right way. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about joy.
Yeah.
Then well, how do we define that? And what's the relationship here with trauma?
So joy, I'm defining as the nervous system state when your nervous system feels safe enough to revel in something. And so when you we go through, we have, I think, many tiny joys throughout the course of any single day, right? You can drink your coffee in the morning and basically not notice that you're drinking your coffee, or you can have a moment where you're like, oh man, this is the best. That first sip of coffee, just gives me this little blast of joy. And then I'm into my email box and that's fine. Right. And I think the reason that I started linking trauma with joy was actually kind of because of a series of personal disasters that happened at the same time as the pandemic. And so I was working with clients and groups and dealing with my own personal stuff, and everything was suddenly so heavy and so dark. So I started leaning into positive psychology, which I had a very healthy dose of skepticism about for my whole career, because the neuroscience hadn't tackled it yet. And one of my weaknesses as a human is I want the science to prove it before I buy in, right?
There's definitely pros and cons. I don't know if I describe that as fully a weakness, because I think we can see the opposite, the cons of the opposite way of thinking.
Yes.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe public policy. Maybe people have been watching the news. Yeah.
It's in there a little bit, a little dose, a little sprinkle here and there. Yeah, for sure. But I think you can go the other way. And sometimes I'm like, I think I'm resistant to things that I could just try. Right.
Sure.
I don't have to wait for the fMRI scans to show that it's
true.
I
mean, we mentioned EMDR as one thing. The biggest criticism is that they can't prove if it does the thing they say it does. However, we can research the fact that people seem to be getting better when they use it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Mostly.
So that's something. Yeah, totally. And so I reached for positive psychology because I was just desperate for more resources. I felt very under-resourced to help people and myself. And then I discovered that there had been a lot of new discoveries in neuroscience about these, methods that they've been using in positive psychology since the 70s. And what they showed is that these positive emotions, joy, hope, gratitude, imagination, all have the power to actually dampen the stress response. So we know that fear inhibits joy, right? And hope and imagination. If you're in a terrified moment in your life, you're not going to be imagining what you're going to do on your next vacation. But the neuroscience discovered in 2015 that the reverse is also true. So that means we can leverage joy and hope and imagination and gratitude to rewire the brain against an overactive stress response, which is sometimes what's happening when you have a lot of trauma. So I started saying, okay, guys, all of the people I'm working with, we need to start using these exercises from positive psychology. But then when I started to deploy them with clients and groups, sometimes they would work really well, but a lot of the time I would meet a ton of resistance. And there's one client, I tell this story early in the book, that actually told me in some colorful language what I could do with joy, and then closed her computer, and it was the end of the therapeutic relationship.
Wow.
And so, right. So that's horrifying to me. And it's like, okay, this resistance, we need to turn to this resistance. What is it telling us? What's the message here? And I don't think that the field of psychology has tailored their exercises and things towards people who are in incredible overwhelm, stress, and trauma. And so this work became, okay, how do we figure out what in us after trauma resists joy? And then how do we combat that? And that's this book and these last 5 or 6 years.
Trying to meet the needs of the client instead of meeting the needs of the theory or program.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Meet people where they are instead of being like, well, we know that this works, and so it's not working with you, and so that's obviously a you problem, which is so detrimental.
I when I worked in community mental health, we had a training once, and it was about what they called measurable goals. And that sounds like something I shouldn't be making fun of, but the definition, and it had to do with state and federal funding for those that were receiving assistance, and they wanted notes to reflect these measurable goals. And it was all about and basically you'd spend the whole session if you followed it, as the statute of limitations gone down, if they can't fire me anymore. Anyway, and some of us, let's just say, we're a little more rigorous with this model than others. But it was we're going to have almost the whole session. We're talking about your 4 to 6 goals and how did you do on a 1 to 10 this week? And if you hit a 6, why didn't you hit a 7? But also, why did you do better than a 5? And it just got to be like this. I don't know what you even call it, but it wasn't therapy. And in this training where they're talking about this, and it was all about like. And there was this factor you're talking about where it definitely did not meet the needs of the client in the room. And my boss turned to me and I had said to him, I was like, this is bullshit, right? I mean, this doesn't, I don't like the way this is being presented. And he turned to me, he's like, oh, it works great. As long as you're dealing with someone who is very, very type A, very, very organized in a certain way, very maybe anal retentive is an old term, and maybe they also have a lot of reading comprehension, and they're actually in a pretty stable place to be able to really crack down. He's like, so none of our patients who come in like the court-ordered substance abuse, high crisis, having trouble even just functioning day to day because of the anxiety and everything so high. Anyway, but that really hit me that I was like, this isn't meeting the needs of anybody who's coming in for help,
Yeah. And God, people, I don't think there is anywhere near the awareness that there needs to be about how these interventions get funded and get into, like, how is your therapist getting trained in EMDR? How long did it take for that to happen? What was the training like, right? How, and so many of these interventions are, that's a whole thing. I'm like just stepping off of the soapbox, but I think if we knew that, then we could be more, aware of what we're actually, what's happening to us in therapy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do you see this then? Let me I wanted to ask a little bit more about kind of the neuroscience part, because I think people love, that's another term that does get thrown around and people will say it and then they'll repeat it. And, and so what kind of things are happening in the brain? What can we tell?
So there's a paper by Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer called Learned Helplessness at 50. And it's incredibly technical. It goes into all of this technical details of things that they've figured out, but all you need to read is the abstract. And it's like, it will tell you exactly what is happening. Basically, to oversimplify it, when you are in a moment where you are leaning into joy or gratitude or imagination, we talk about some exercises to do that in a second. You are activating a set of areas in the brain that sort of wire together to form what they have termed the hope circuit. And when the hope circuit is online in the brain, the fear circuit, the limbic system, the amygdala, all that stuff is by definition offline, because those two circuits take too much energy to be on at the same time. So kind of like if you think about the wiring in an old house, right? Like you can't run the air conditioner and the microwave at the same time because you'll blow a fuse. Same is true of your brain. You have limited electrical circuitry. And so if you are intentionally spending time in hope and joy and gratitude, by definition, you are turning off the fear circuit. The reason that's so important is because that circuitry is telling your body what hormones to produce and how fast. So when you're in the fear circuit, you're getting all the stress hormones that are super critical in a moment of danger, but not so much when you're just kind of marinating in them in your office, right? Or trying to sleep. And so the hope circuit gives you the dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin when you're doing these exercises. And those are the hormones that counter stress and get you to a point of relaxation and rest. So it's really, really critical that we figure out how to find tools that can be used for people who are in acute crisis, because it would have an immediate effect on their biology.
Mm. And that's interesting because the alternate, you talk about that limbic system stuff, that's the thing we've always identified as being an acute crisis. Also has a lot to do with addiction too. Because we're living in that. And some they used to talk about the sort of 30 seconds of awareness / planning / goal directed behavior. If I'm in that 30 seconds Especially if I'm
Yeah.
doing 1 to 10 ratings on 16 goals,
You're
and
right.
I'm like, well, I need to get out of this room and get high
Right.
or not get
Right.
high. And that's all I can think
Right.
about. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, let's get into that. The exercise piece is I love actionable things, as everybody knows. And
Yeah.
this is how we get there so that we don't just shut our computer and toss it out. Well, I hope she didn't toss it out the window, but so that we don't just
Yeah. I
opt
hope
out
so.
and say, this sounds like
Yeah.
it's not going to work.
Right, totally. Yes. And I think when we know a little bit of the biology, then we have the buy-in, right? Or maybe that's just me, but it's like, okay, if we know that this is likely to work, then I'm much more likely to do it. So I'll give you the lowest lift, highest impact exercise, which I call tiny little joys. So the first thing that you do, and we're talking about somebody who is resistant to joy, so we'll start with this first part is optional if you're joy friendly, but if you're like joy f that, right? Start with a compost pile. So on a piece of paper you take your pen and you write compost, and then you just write all of the things that are crap right now in this moment, right? So like, it's raining here, it's cold, the gutters are clogged, right? I have a runny nose. Maybe it's a cold. If I don't like my haircut, maybe I had a fight with a friend, right? You just write all those things down. And then you take a deep breath and you survey your environment for something that gives you a tiny blast of joy.
Hmm.
And so most of us in our offices, or you could do this anywhere, you can do this in the grocery store or whatever, you can usually find something. I've never actually encountered someone who was like, I can't find anything. And I've worked with folks in the prison system. So
Hmm.
like, I have all of these things in my office that are from friends who went on trips and gave me little things. I have little figurines everywhere that make me happy. There's the llama lamp in
Mostly
the
llamas. We were
background.
talking about this
Yes.
before we got on. For those that are just audio, there's a wonderful little lamp with the llama with a lamp coming out of its back. And
Yeah.
you mentioned the trauma llama kind of mental phrase anyway. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, we make trauma absurd, and then it's less hard to deal with. So I can look at that trauma llama lamp, and then I can think about all of the people that I've worked with who laughed about that, and how people will send me llama things. They'll send me llama text messages and gifs and little memes, but then also like actual objects. And then I just spend 10 seconds leaning into that feeling of joy. And then I go right back to my day, and I go right back to the compost pile. So, like, if I really want to mull on how the bad weather and I'm like in that cranky mood, I can stay there, no problem. But I gave myself 10 seconds of a break, which I know caused a flood of positive hormones and chemicals in my brain and body.
Hmm. Yeah. And try not to smile when you think of a llama, but
Right.
I love the definition you say of a tiny blast, because
Yeah.
that's so much more achievable than saying, and this is where positive psychology I think turned off a lot of us, is the
Yeah.
idea that it's like, here's affirmations, the
Mhm.
affirmation style of intervention of just everything's great. And I always feel like
Yeah.
our brain is no more willing, well, it's not any healthier to
Yeah.
accept the idea that everything's great than it is to say that everything's terrible. Right.
Right, exactly. Right, exactly. And it's so dismissive, right? And so that's why it's like, so I built this exercise, which is so small, and I've been doing it every day on Instagram, and I will tell you a funny story about that in a second. But um, it has a bunch of little things in it. So our brain has a negativity bias. So we're always clocking all the bad things that are happening to us, and that's to our evolutionary advantage. We wouldn't have made it this far if we didn't do that. But when you put the compost pile down, it's like, okay, brain, I get it. There's bad stuff. It's here. I understand that. The purpose of joy is not to erase that stuff. I'm going to put it down on the paper first. The purpose of joy is to give me a 10-second break from it.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that really changes your mindset and all of these things is being able to see that in any terrible, dark day, there is also joy, always. Like, it meets you in the dark. And I think because we misdefine joy as this thing that has to be like pure and over here, and we get to it when we have no struggle and no healing work to do, then we're really missing out, because it is such a tenacious tool that we could and should be using in our, especially in acute trauma healing stages.
Mhm. Yeah, and the idea or assumption that there is something to find. I like how you put that too. You
Yeah.
haven't really found people that are like, there's nothing, especially if we
Yeah.
really think about it.
Yeah,
You know,
totally.
yeah,
In any situation, and literally any situation. And I think you can also look back into the history of, think about like Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning and people's accounts from, the concentration camps, right? If folks can find little slivers of joy in those moments, so can we.
hmm
And
I can't think of Frankel without thinking about his feedback. And this is where it goes deeper than just affirmations, right?
yeah,
I heard him speak about, on a recording. I didn't get to be there, but anyway. So, talking about how he used to picture giving lectures or writing a book, which he did,
yeah,
someday while he was in the concentration camp. He would
yeah,
think about, I'm going to tell
yeah,
people about this, and what am I? I would picture himself giving this lecture and say, I'm just going to assume that I'm going to do that unless I literally know for sure that I'm going to die,
right,
and that. And that idea helped a lot, and there was hope
right.
there. Yeah.
Because it's an anchor. And if you think about like a physical anchor, right, you have this huge giant ship and the huge ocean, right? These things are bigger than you can imagine, but it's the anchor that keeps the ship where it's supposed to be. And that anchor comparatively is tiny, but that doesn't make it unimportant. It's still grounding.
This
And
is a good metaphor.
thank you. So I've been doing this practice every day this year because I said I was going to on January 1st on Instagram in front of like 50,000 people or whatever. So now I have to, right? And the universe, because it's hilarious, has turned up one of the most stressful, intense years of my life. And so I've gotten to see in real time what it looks like when you are practicing this in the absolute midst of chaos. And it's really a gift. Like, and I should be like, well, I wrote the book about it, so of course I knew that was going to happen. I didn't know,
Mhm.
right? Like I was talking about it, I knew that it worked, I knew that the neuroscience worked, but the lived experience of like, let me do this every single day of this year that's going to serve up these like weird horrors every month, like that has been incredible because it is immensely grounding and it's such a small lift. Like I've had mono, I had Bell's palsy, one of my friends died. I moved into a place and then had to move promptly out because there were
Oh,
rats and rat mites. Like it's just like this is to the point of absurdity. If I wrote this in a story, you'd be like,
you'd be like,
too
well,
much,
that's a little too convenient, but whatever.
yeah,
Yeah,
right,
right.
all in
So
1 year, come on.
that'd be like
And
one of those
then
ER episodes where the patient comes in and it has to do with what's going on in Dr. Carter's life.
yes, exactly. And also there's like a bomb in their torso or whatever, and
Right,
everybody's
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, that
yeah,
too.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
you don't have that one happen. That's good. I love
No,
when
no,
that
not yet.
happens. Yeah,
It's only
always
October. We'll see.
puts the um well, it's wonderful guidelines and things, and like I say, there's lots of things that people can find in addition with exercise wise in what you're writing.
Yes.
And once again, everybody, the book is The Joy Reset. Now, I wanted to give, as always, a chance for people to know where best place to get the book, where they can follow you online. I always like to
Yeah.
ask a little question of everyone first, which is to help highlight for people a way to give back to participate in society in a good way. Do you have any kind of a charities or nonprofits that are something that are near and dear to you and your life?
Yes, I have two that I have worked with extensively. The first is Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles,
Love Homeboy
California.
Industries. Tell everybody.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Father Greg Boyle runs this amazing nonprofit where he works with reintegrating previously incarcerated folks, gang members typically, back into society. So helping them deal with and process what they've been through childhood all the way to adulthood and through their incarceration, and then also to help them find employment and keep it. So it's an incredible organization that I had the immense honor to work with for a couple of years and
Wow.
just was absolutely changed.
He's one who I did get to hear live in a conference once
Oh,
giving a
yeah. He's
presentation.
amazing.
I just love that concept of like he couldn't get people in the community to agree to hire his parishioners, so he had them start businesses.
Yep.
Yes, I loved that
Yes,
mentality.
I know.
Yeah.
That's like that subversive, like, yes, rebellion. Yeah, that's an amazing one. And then the second one is First Five California, which is a nonprofit that works to improve the lives of children and families throughout California. They work with other social services industries and do incredible work helping people in the foster system, and they do education for the all the different counties, and it's a wonderful organization.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing those. Now, where do we find you out there? Is there social media places, website? What's the best place to land?
Yes. So I am on Instagram and TikTok at the same handle, which is just mc.phd. And then my website is alchemycoaching.life. And you can find my books on any book website of your choice, whether that's an independent bookstore or a giant evil conglomerate to you.
Yes, I love it. It's the accessibility, isn't it? That's still there's a handshake with the devil for modern society. Yeah. That's a whole nother topic, but but exactly, that is out there. And I will say, whether it's on those platforms or Goodreads, I always like when I have authors to just mention to people, take the time to mark. I think the only option is 5-star, but if you put a good review on it, doesn't take as many as you think before that book starts showing up on people's recommendations, which does help. So if you believe in the message, get on there, and put the review. Even if you haven't read the book, take our word for it. No, but anyway, you should probably read the book before you do that, I guess.
Read the preface, at least.
At least the preface, right? Exactly. well, I don't want to tell people how to live, but real quick mention for everybody that our highlighted charity for this month, in fact, these 2 months, October and November, whenever this one's dropping, one of those, we are highlighting the Because organization and their virtual walkathon/run to raise money for helping people who are victims and have come through human trafficking. They fill an important niche centered in Philadelphia. They occupy this little space that is unfortunately rarely addressed, which is those that have already emerged from trafficking and are not in that situation anymore, but need to be part of society and to get ready to take care of their health care, their vocational, academic, and psychological health. And so the Because organization does a great job. They've been guests on this show before and been a note of highlight as well. So if you go to becauseorganization.org, you can find the details about that and sign up. Since it's a virtual fundraiser, you can walk or run anywhere. It's not an event where you have to be a place at a time. You can just do it anytime this and next month to help that cause out. Also, of course, anybody, as always, if you join the Broken Brains Patreon to help support the podcast, 50% of your donation will go to the charity of focus in the month that you joined for the rest of until the sun explodes, or as long as you remain a patron of the Patreon. Whichever of those two events happens first, then that's how long it will go.
Wonderful.
MC, thank you so much. This has been so great, and I just am grateful for you and writing the book and doing the work you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. What a lovely conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Court and Parts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court and Parts shows, visit courtandarts.com.